Well, kia ora, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Passing the Torch. Today, I'm very thrilled to be joined by Nándor Tánczos. I I practiced that before, and I still got it nearly. So thank you for joining us today, Nándor.
Yeah. Thank you, Connor. It's good to be having a chat about these important things.
Absolutely. So I'm just going to start off the same way I start all of my interviews, which is if you could just give me a brief introduction in your own words of who you are.
um, there's many different ways to answer such a question. Um, so, um, so ko tisa te awa, ko mogo te tangata, ko hanakeria tōku pāpā, ko uriai kama te maunga, ko Elephants River te awa, no Afrika ki te tonga tōku mama, ko Nando ahau, kei Whakatāne e noho ana. So, to begin, my people come from, on my father's side, from Hungary. So my father was, when he was a young man, was involved in the uprising against the Russian occupation of Hungary in 1956. And after that was brutally repressed, he fled his homeland as a refugee, went to Austria, and ended up in England, where he met my mother, who's Cape-coloured South African, who'd left South Africa, I suppose, to explore more opportunities than were available to her back home as they were starting to construct apartheid. And the two of them met, and so I was born in England along with my brother. Came to Aotearoa when I was about 7, so in the kind of mid to early 70s, and grew up in Auckland mostly. I was very engaged in anarchist politics from a young age through listening to punk music, and that introduced me to the ideas of anarchism. And then I found this rich history and philosophy that kind of was available there through all this literature and history and such. So when I finished school, I went back to England for 4 years. I lived in the far north of England, studied to be a journalist. And I was living in the north of England when the miners' strike happened under Margaret Thatcher. And so that was my first introduction to like real politics on the ground. We were collecting money for the striking miners because they were on strike for a year and a half. The government froze all the union money. So we were just kind of, and that was the first time I saw the police used as a explicitly political force for political agenda to destroy the mine workers union, because they were literally blockading off miners' villages. If you tried to get supplies through to help families, they would turn you away, and then they were using really brutal tactics against the miners. And after that, I joined the peace convoy, and that was my first introduction to really lived anarchy, because the convoy were outlaws. They lived entirely outside the law. The law was irrelevant. In fact, the first time I went to the Stonehenge festival, I observed police vehicles burnt out where the police had been evicted from the site, a site of 100,000 people living in total anarchy because there was no hierarchy and no ruling, and the whole thing was self-governed. It was quite an extraordinary experience. So that was kind of how that was my first introductions to political activism, I suppose. They were quite, they were quite seminal for me, I suppose. When I came back to Aotearoa, I went to university, and after that I became involved with the National Organisation for the Reform of Marijuana Laws. So this was in the kind of early 90s, and we developed at the time a really powerful non-violent direct action campaign. In fact, I think at that time in the 90s, Normal was one of the largest activist groups outside of the Tino Rangatiratanga movement, because we had branches all over the country. We were really active. We were training constantly with of our non-violent action nonviolent direct action theory and practice. So we would hold annual camps and we'd get activists from all over the country and we'd go through training about how to handle different situations. And that's one of the things I want to say that's really important is I think activists training and studying the theories of power and how power works and how we can challenge it from positions of we can challenge the powerful from positions of relative powerlessness. And how do we do that? What are the levers that we have to challenge power as ordinary people? So with the cannabis law reform movement, we did a lot of that. We had to think a lot about how do you create change, and one of the key things was around being really focused. So I was involved in other things around the time, and what I saw was a lot of political activism was kind of unfocused. People focused on, I hesitate to say the wrong targets, but people sometimes focused on things that were peripheral rather than focusing on where the real issues were. So we spent a lot of time thinking about that and studying that, and we had actually a relatively successful campaign with big mass demonstrations on the streets and all kinds of things. We had a program going where we had a bus line. So if people were being busted, they could ring up the bus line, and we were on the other end. We weren't trained lawyers; we were paralegals, and we were able to give some basic advice, simple stuff. Don't say anything. Don't admit anything. don't consent to any searches, all that kind of stuff. And out of that, we developed this campaign called the Roaring Lion campaign, because what we saw was that, the government couldn't arrest all the people who use cannabis. And clearly they weren't trying to. They were focusing on young brown men predominantly. That's who was predominantly getting arrested, although use was spread pretty evenly across the population. And so we had this idea that we can make the system unenforceable by refusing to cooperate. So we had these roaring lions where people, if they got arrested for cannabis, they would refuse to plea when they went to court. They'd go back a few times, then the court would enter a not guilty plea on their behalf. And the idea is you refuse to plea because you don't recognise the charge. You don't recognise the state has the right to determine for you what you can and can't do with your own body. So refuse to recognise the charge, and then refuse to cooperate with the court case. And then when it came time to sentencing, the judge would say, "I'm going to give you a $200 fine," and people would say, "I'm not going to pay it, Your Honour. You might as well put me in jail because I'm not going to pay a fine." And then sometimes they'd go away, and then people would be rearrested for not paying their fines, eventually get sent to jail. The idea is that enough people did this, they would have to stop because the prisons were already full. They just couldn't take. The idea, the image was of like a dog biting your hand, and then rather than trying to pull it away, you just push your hand down its throat until it gags. That was the kind of theory of it. And we had some quite powerful stuff, and all of this stuff actually put cannabis law reform on the political agenda until in 1999. Actually, cannabis law reform was an election issue. It was a huge election issue. We didn't succeed, and I can talk about some of the reasons why we failed at the parliamentary end. But to me, it was an example of how you could build a mass movement out of people who are generally written off. Because this is the thing with the campaign, everyone was saying, "Oh, you need some lawyers to front your campaign for you. You need some guys in suits and all this." And the reality is, there was no lawyers and no guys in suits who were going to front the campaign for us. We had to do it ourselves, and our idea was, we're as good as anyone. So, we had to find creative ways of doing what we needed to do. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I just want to go wind back to sort of the start of that that statement.
It's a bit of a long rave, sorry.
Yeah, yeah, that's all right. you talked about so you were born in England, but then you moved to Aotearoa when you were young. Could you tell me about like your childhood and your adolescence growing up here?
in Aotearoa.
Mm.
Um, the first thing I'd say was moving here was disappointing because yeah, so my father's Hungarian. We lived in England. We used to go to Hungary to see my grandparents. Once it took a while before my father could go back because he was fearful of arrest for quite a long time. But then we got the word that they were no longer persecuting people for their involvement in the revolution. So we used to go back and see my grandparents, my cousins, and all that. And you go to Hungary and you speak Hungarian, you know, and everything's Hungarian. The people behave like Hungarians, and they eat different things, and they live differently, you know. And so we thought, well, when we come here, well, we'd all be speaking Māori, and we'd be, you know, living in whare, and you know, and then we got here, it was like, oh, okay, it's kind of a bit like England, really, which was a disappointment to me as a young child. Um, but growing up, I mean, I grew up in Auckland on the North Shore, and it was very Pākehā where I grew up. There weren't a lot of Māori kids in my school, in my neighbourhood, and yeah, so I was pretty monocultural in the society that I grew up in. We were different because we weren't like Anglos, we weren't like all the other Anglos. So I was always aware of being a bit different, and because um, I'm fairly I'm pale, you know, but often in my life I've been mistaken for Maori. So I kind of occupied this slightly ambiguous place, I suppose, and so and observed all that racism and homophobia and all that stuff growing up, you know. But I mean, my own personal childhood was a good childhood. You know, my parents were loving people. We didn't really want for anything. My parents were frugal people, so they knew how to live simply, but you know, but we never lacked for anything. And it was a political household too. We spent a lot of time talking politics over the breakfast table on the weekends or over dinner, you know. So I was grew up in a house where we were really aware of what was going on in the world around us, and my parents, I suppose, encouraged me and my brother to discuss and debate and challenge views, and they would challenge our views. When adults came around for dinner, they used to love having dinner parties. You know, we were encouraged to participate and be active participants in the conversation. You know, and so that was a really good way to grow up because it made me grow up in a environment where ideas were always being tested. Yeah, and you were free to express your view, but you had to be able to back it up with some argument if someone questioned you. You know, so it's good. It was I think it was a really healthy upbringing. Yeah, I was really blessed, and that's one of the things in my life. I see people can be very judgmental of others sometimes, and I'm always really aware that if I'd grown up in under different circumstances, I'd be a very different person. You know, and
Mhm.
so I think it's important that we always, those of us who were blessed to have good upbringings, as we all should have, you know, but we should remain humble about that and recognize that not everyone had those opportunities, and therefore try not to be too self-righteous about it.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Um, and then you moved back to England, to the north of England, as you said, and studied to be a journalist, studied journalism. What drew you to do that? Was it, do you think, that sort of debates around the kitchen table, that sort of thing?
It was actually, so when I was 14, my parents sent me to live with my grandparents in Hungary for a year. So I went to school there, and and of course, none of my family in Hungary spoke English. Some of the younger ones do now, but at that time, no one spoke English. I don't think I knew anyone in the city of Szeged, where my family's from, that spoke English, except the English teacher at school. So it was like real immersion, and it was a really amazing opportunity to get to know my own people and my language and my culture, to experience living in Hungary, get to know my extended family, because Táncsos are a big family in Hungary. Here, there's just our nuclear family, but there, you know, it's a big whānau. And it's quite interesting because in many ways Hungarian culture has many similarities with Maori culture, and I think human culture actually has similarities all around the world. We all value similar things, kind of natural human culture, but of course we've become increasingly industrialized, and we've been robbed of our human culture and become just become kind of industrial culture. It's a different thing. But anyway, so I was living in Hungary. It was communist Hungary at the time. And so while Hungary was one of the most free of the Eastern Bloc countries, I was confronted by a whole lot of things that I wasn't used to. The kind of having to carry an ID card wherever you went, and the police being able to pull you up and ask to see your papers. I wasn't used to that kind of thing. It was a centrally planned economy. So, and I saw, and this is why I'm not a communist, because it was dysfunctional. The whole system only ran on bribery and corruption. That's how you got anything, was you did everything under the table. People went to work to rest from their real occupation, which was wheeling and dealing, kind of in the illegal market. And so that was very interesting to see. And all these things that kind of, while I was there, I just had this thing. I wanted to write about what was going on in the world. I wanted to write the truth so people could see the truth. Because in Hungary, certainly the papers weren't telling the truth. And in fact, neither were they in the West particularly either. So I wanted to write the truth. And that's why I wanted to be a journalist. I've always loved writing, but I wanted to report the truth. Of course, when I went and studied journalism, I realized very quickly that that's not what journalism is for the most part. And in fact, it's very rare journalists who get to really devote themselves to exposing the truth. Investigative journalists do, but it's rare, So you can think about people like Nikki Hager in our country, or Robert Fisk, or people like this who do this amazing work, but they're quite rare. Most journalism is pretty humdrum, writing about I don't know, the stuff that in the scheme of things isn't actually that important most of the time.
Yeah. And that was, as you said, was around the time you started getting involved in those activist movements, like with the miners' strike and the peace convoys. What do you remember? Was there anything specific that made you want to get involved there? Like what was it like being part of those spaces?
So if I'll just treat the two separately for a moment. So I actually got involved with a kind of a socialist, a hard left socialist group in this town I was living in called Darlington, and that's what kind of first got me involved in miner support work, and I wanted to do that work because I could see what was happening. The onslaught against the mining villages. It was horrific. People died in there. The police brutality was insane. The police were, horse charging picket lines and whacking people on the back of the head as they ran away, and like these serious head injuries and things like that. It was brutal stuff, So I wanted to support in some way. So I got involved with this left wing group, and that quickly again just reinforced for me that kind of hard left politics was not for me, because most of the time they spent their time criticizing other people on the left and talking about who was going to be up against the wall when the revolution came, and it's like that's not the kind of politics I was interested in. But the miners' work was really important work, In terms of the peace convoy, what happened is I was involved with the Peace Action Group. The anti-nuclear movement was quite powerful at the time. I remember going to a protest in Barrow and Furness, and I think there'd been like 1 million people there. So it was this insane protest against nuclear weapons, because of course at the time everyone was living in fear of nuclear war. It's a real thing. It was the trauma of my generation growing up. It's people kind of don't think about it too much these days, I don't think, but it was a and the number of quite near misses that happened because they had their weapons defense systems and alert things. And, the world was on the brink of nuclear war numerous times when I was growing up and around that time. So there was this massive thing against it, and Britain had like Trident submarines, which were nuclear armed, and they had cruise missiles, which were like put on lorries. They drive them around the countryside. In the case of a nuclear attack, so they could fire them at the enemy. So there was this mass movement against it, and I remember watching the news one night and seeing there'd been a peace camp. A lot of people have heard of the Greenham Common Peace Camp, which was a women's only peace camp. Really amazing stuff those women were doing, really powerful. There'd been one at so Greenham Common was it was an RAF base, and Molesworth was similarly, it was an RAF base from the war that was being used as a cruise missile base to store them while ready in preparation for trucking them around the country if they were going to go off, and so these people had squatted this. It was intended to be a cruise missile base. These people had squatted it, and so they comprised of, like, there was a lot of Quakers there who, I've got huge respect for Quakers. They're really amazing peace activists, and they'd built this chapel there, and then these kind of travellers had gone there and squatted it as well, and a whole bunch of different people. And then one night in the middle of the night, the military had come in, evicted them. The Minister of Defence was all around strutting like a peacock, and they'd been growing wheat and stuff that they'd said they were going to send it to Ethiopia because there's the famine going on and stuff, and they'd raised all their crops to the ground and evicted them onto the road. Off you go, and then erected this big razor wire fence all around it, so they could use it as their nuclear base. And so a whole bunch of us went down straight away to kind of protest. And I remember those first nights after they'd been evicted, we all turned up, and the military wouldn't let us put up any shelter or anything. So it was cold. It was the middle of winter, and it was snow, and we had a fire going, and everyone was huddled around the fire trying to keep warm, just to have a presence there to say we did not support what had happened. And me and my girlfriend at the time, we were started going down regularly to this vigil at Molesworth. And while we were there, someone said, these people who'd been evicted, they'd parked up, a lot of the traveller types had parked up down the road. So we went to visit them, and they were like, next stop Stonehenge, because the Stonehenge Free Festival had been going on for about 12 years at this stage. And it was this amazing, as I say, anarchic, free festival. It was free to get in. There was a whole lot of free stuff there. People gave away free food and free stuff. And it was this amazing place. And we'd been to it in 84, or in 83, and it had blown my mind, And then these guys were like, well, the government's trying to ban the free festival, so that's our next stop. So we actually went back to Darlington and bought a little VW combi and joined the convoy, went on the road, gave up everything in town and just went on the road. And so we went to the Stonehenge Festival in 84. And there's a few documentaries and stuff around it, but basically the convoy was on the way to the Stonehenge, and the police diverted everyone down a side road, blocked off the front, blocked off the back, and then just came down and beat the shit out of everyone. And again, just brutal, and arrested everyone, and we all got arrested, and then they impounded everyone's vehicles. Everyone was homeless until they would release the vehicle. While the vehicles were impounded, the police had just gone through and just destroyed people's homes, just like open up cans of baked beans and thrown around the place, smashed kids' toys, smashed the dash, just smashed everything, just complete vandalism, just because they could, I suppose. And so that was the start of my time with the convoy. It was
and I mean,
yeah. Sorry.
You're talking about your police brutality there. Of course, later on when you were in Parliament, justice and oversight of that sort of thing was a big part of your
Mm.
focus. Do you think that was the sort of start of that?
Um, Certainly, I mean, that gave me a lot of interest in questions of justice. In fact, I remember when I was an MP and I was on the Justice and Electoral Select Committee the whole time I was in Parliament, and one of the first inquiries we did was into the policing of the Free Tibet protest when the Chinese premier had come, which I'd actually been involved in as well, because people had been peaceful protesters had been like waving to Free Tibet flags and things like this, and the police had gone to extraordinary lengths to make sure that the Chinese authorities couldn't see any, couldn't see any Free Tibet presence. So they would park buses in front of protesters. They arrested a whole bunch of protesters to get them out of the area. This is a classic police tactic, right? Arrest people, take them out. You don't charge them. You just release them half a day later. But by then it's too late. You've taken them out of the scene, right? Doing all those kinds of things. So we actually had an inquiry into the policing of that, and that was really good to be part of. And Tim Barnett was the chair and did a great job chairing as well, because the committee ended up producing quite a good report that really emphasised that the job of the police is not to protect the sensitivities of foreign governments. That the police of the job is to protect order, but it's also to protect the right of free speech. That part of the order that the police are protecting is the right of people to demonstrate, and the right of free speech and the right to make their views known. And so the police instruction manual of how to police public order situations changed as a result of that report. So yeah, I was quite proud that we did that work.
Yeah. And I mean, there's been a lot of talk in I think places like Britain, some Australian states. There's a lot of legislative moves to sort of crack down a bit on protesting. What do you think of the state of protest laws around the world and in New Zealand?
It's I'm probably not as up to date as I should be on what's happening internationally, but I am aware there's a couple of things. For a long time, what we were seeing was an increase in use of civil penalties against activists. So if you couldn't convict them for offences under criminal law, then corporations were suing them for loss of profits or loss of earnings and things like that, with an attempt to bankrupt activist organizations and activist individuals. And so people kind of looking to get around, in a way, what the law really allowed them. And that's a really disturbing thing. I think people need to be protected from that kind of predatory behavior. The other thing I've seen now recently, climate activists are being particularly targeted, and new laws being brought in to target climate activists. And again, it's because what we're seeing is activists becoming more disruptive, right? Because the situation that we face is becoming so desperate and so drastic. People are just going like, wake the fuck up, wake up, and doing whatever they feel they need to do to wake people up. And I don't always agree with the targets that people choose, because, and I'll talk about this if you like, but one of the things I think is really important to be really clear who your targets are and what you're trying to do with any particular action. But regardless of that, the frustration and anger that I think probably particularly young people feel, the world is burning, and those in charge still don't seem to be doing anything about it. Certainly nothing remotely proportionate to the scale and urgency of what we face. So people are frustrated and trying desperately to get governments and corporations to do something. And the response to that is to punish them harder, it's to be more punitive, and rather than actually take what they're saying really seriously. And it's a completely backward step in my view. And it's interesting because, if you take, for example, the anti-vax occupation at Parliament that happened here recently, where a lot of people I know who were there talk about the brutality and how terrible it was, and the police were out of hand. As someone who's been doing this stuff for, 40 years, I don't think I've ever seen the police act as restrained as what they did with the Parliament protests. Honestly, most of the stuff I've been involved in, within the first day, people would have been truncheoned and taken out. And the fact that it lasted as long as it did, with very little kind of in the way of reaction. I mean, stupid stuff. Trevor Mallard did really stupid stuff. But in terms of actual serious kind of reaction from the police, there was very little. And even when they finally got evicted, I still think the police were incredibly restrained in the face of what they were dealing with, where they were being physically attacked, in really extreme ways. I can't quite get my head around why that is, because what we're seeing is the police being more punitive to climate activists and people who are actually trying to do something about the real challenges that we face. Meanwhile, that, which to me was kind of bizarre, the whole thing, seemed to be treated quite leniently, and even people in that what's now become this kind of anti-vax, neo-Nazi kind of milieu of stuff, with all those crazy people running around, and people making serious threats of violence and death against named individuals, and the police don't seem to be doing anything about it. And if that was like Tame Iti, for example, I doubt that they would be treating it quite the same. So it's quite weird what's going on. I don't quite understand it.
Yeah, I know. A bit of a dichotomy for sure. You then, in 1999 was when you became a Green MP, but the election before, you'd run as well for the Aotearoa Legalized Cannabis Party.
Yeah.
Obviously, you've talked about how you were involved on the activism side of things, but what made you want to move into explicit politics?
Yeah. Parliamentary politics. Yeah. So we were doing normal stuff, and when the 96 election came by, the first MMP election, the normal activists decided to start the Aotearoa Legalized Cannabis Party, and I ran for them. And at the time, I mean, we were really hopeful that we were going to get some people into Parliament, because there seemed to be quite a wave behind us, and there'd been the campaign had been quite big. The organisation itself ran into real difficulties coming close to the election, because what ended up happening is a whole bunch of people who also thought the party had a good chance of getting elected kind of got involved. People I describe as carpetbaggers, and it destroyed the kaupapa, because until then, everyone involved in cannabis law reform, no one was in it for any status or money, because there was no money to be had and very little status. And so everyone was there for the right reasons. But when people started to think seriously somebody might get an MP salary, suddenly it changed, and you saw people coming around whose agenda was a more personal one. And so the thing kind of crashed and burned a little bit going into the 1996 election. But we'd kind of started that up to kind of, because also we were talking about normal as the normal freedom movement. So it wasn't just about cannabis law reform. And I've got to say, for me, in a way, cannabis law reform has always been quite a small issue in some ways, but it's always been a litmus test for me, because it speaks to much bigger issues around the role of the state, and what right does the state have to determine what we do with our own bodies. And it spoke to things like industrial hemp and the suppression of this natural plant with huge uses, in favor of the kind of petrochemical industry and such, So and the medicinal use. It kind of, so cannabis itself was in a way quite small, It spoke to these larger issues, also to the racism of the justice system, where cannabis use is widespread, but it's predominantly young Māori men who are being arrested and charged for it. So I suppose you had this idea that if we got elected into Parliament as a bunch of wild people, that we could push this kind of broader freedom agenda. Freedom's become a different kind of word now, but at the time, we were talking about the real liberty of people. So that had kind of motivated my involvement with the ALCP. After that didn't work, those of us who started it up kind of went, we just went to fold it up, and other people said, no, we think it's got some value. So they kept it going, and that's good on them. They've been doing something else with it. But in particular, like people like Chris Fowley and Mike Finlayson and myself, we kind of went, no, that's not going anywhere. And so we went back to normal activism, and we the three of us actually opened up the hemp store because we wanted to create an economic base for our activism, something that was a business that was in alignment with our values, but also would free us up to do more activist work or pay the bills for us to do activist work. And we were going on and doing that, and then a friend actually came through and said, I'm just going to the Green Party conference. We're looking at leaving the Alliance. Why don't you come? And I'd met some Greens before that, and I'd liked them. I'd liked what the Greens were about. But I'd never been interested in joining because as part of the Alliance, they were very much dominated by Jim Anderton and this kind of old left way of thinking, which was really repugnant to me. And so I'd never been interested in joining. But Wayne Parsonson took me down to Wellington to took me down to the Hui down in Wellington, and I was there for the Green Party getting together to discuss whether they were going to leave the Alliance. And it was quite an amazing thing for me to witness because I'd never been around parliamentary politics before, and I saw Jeanette Fitzsimons and Rod Donald and the way they operated and acted, and the humility that they had, which I wasn't used to in a member of Parliament. Not that I knew many, but they had this kind of humility around them, and then the whole party was a grassroots thing. It was like a room full of activists who were doing parliamentary activism rather than a room full of politicians. That's kind of the difference that I had in my mind. And so I was really attracted to what I saw going on there. And at the time, and at that point, the Greens decided they would leave the Alliance and became an independent Green Party. And I joined the Green Party that day. And I spoke at that hui to say, as an outsider, we desperately need someone who can speak to the issues of the 21st century. And there's no political party doing it. And the Greens are the only political party with the capability of doing it, in my view. That's how I saw it, And so I joined when they became independent. At the time, the Greens were polling like less than 1%. So the media was very quick to write off the Greens as a political force. So, they're over now. But I felt that there was something there. I could feel this momentum, And so I joined, and Rod. Then we had a regional conference in the north, and I spoke there with and I invited some young people to come on stage with me to talk to different issues rather than just me, hear a variety of voices. And Rod heard that, and he invited me to start up a youth wing kind of. In Australia, they had this thing of the Wild Young Greens, and he said, why don't you start up something similar? So I talked with my kind of the people around me, and we decided we didn't want to do the Wild Young Greens. That sounded a bit naff. But we were going to start up the Wild Greens, and not as a youth wing, but more as a direct action group attached to the Greens. And we just proceeded to do a bunch of stuff which we thoroughly enjoyed. So we used to go to dance. So now Know Your Stuff is a legally recognised drug testing service. Back in '99, we imported reagent tests from Holland, and we were just going into nightclubs, and we'd set up a stall and we'd test people's drugs. It's completely illegal at that time. and then the Home Show found out about it, and so they interviewed me outside this club, about what we were doing. So I had to ring Jeanette Fitzsimons and say, hey, you should know that we're going to be on the Home Show tomorrow night, and she, and we went down to the West Coast, and we got involved in the campaign against the logging of Rimu forest down there. So we went down and did a bunch of that stuff. We used to do critical mass bike rides to promote alternatives, active transport. So we'd get a mass of us and we'd ride around the streets and block traffic and stuff like that. And that would really annoy people too, but just trying to say it's not all about cars, And then, of course, when we really came to public attention was when some wild greens broke into the Lincoln University Research Centre and uprooted some genetically engineered potatoes that they were working on and destroyed their trials. And then I went into the media speaking on behalf of the group, neither confirming nor denying whether I myself had been there, but able to say, but this is why the people who did it did it. And that really, I think that really brought us to attention, because at the time the genetic engineered campaign, the campaign against genetic engineering was again really growing momentum, and I think that really helped kickstart it as well, because most people didn't even know that we were doing it. Most people had no idea what was happening with genetic engineering in this country. They had no idea that our research centres were testing it, doing trials of it, field trials of it. And there was no rules around it. There was no control. It was just like the scientists were just going off and doing their thing. And I love science, don't get me wrong. I love science. But science also needs some social control over what it does, because otherwise it's just in control of the corporations who fund it. So it's the control is corporate control, but there's no democratic control. And so that was our argument, was that we actually need democratic control, because we think, and not just us, a number of geneticists also think, that there's potential for great harm. And especially in those early days, no one quite knew what the potential was. And even the people doing the work didn't really know a lot about what they were doing. I mean, I don't know if they still do, but they used to talk about junk DNA and stuff, which is like all the stuff they don't know what it does. Oh, it's just junk. Well, no, it does something. You just don't know what it is. And you start messing with it, you don't quite know what the outcome's going to be, So, yeah, so that's really what that was around. And it comes back to what something I was talking about earlier about your focus, because if you look at the theory around nonviolent direct action, there's a couple of things there that are really important. And one of them is that your action needs to speak directly to the issue. So when you do something as a direct action, and this is different from like a direct communication, a lot of what Greenpeace does, for example, is direct communication. They climb up a chimney stack and drop a banner. That's great. It's awesome work. But it's not a direct action, because they're just using it to raise awareness. A direct action is something that achieves the result in the process of your action. So a direct action would be to block the chimney stack. Or in the case of genetic engineering, what we were saying is we want the trials to stop until there's some rules and democratic accountability around it. So the direct action is to stop the trial. We didn't ask them to stop the trial. We stopped the trial. That's a direct action.
Yeah.
And so and the idea is that it's like that thing about, even people should understand what you're talking about, even if the TV's sound's turned off. You shouldn't have to explain what your action is to people. You shouldn't have to really explain why you did it. It should be clear in the process of doing it what you're trying to say.
Yeah, absolutely. One thing that really just interests me in particular, I mean, you were a List MP for your whole term, but as was every Green until recently.
Well, Jeanette
but
Fitzsimons,
yes, Jeanette Fitzsimons won Coromandel, but you ran in the Auckland Central seat, which of course is now held by Chloe, and I campaign with Chloe in Auckland Central. And what really
Thank you.
interests me is what really interests me about that is, I mean, your top result in Auckland Central was 20%, which isn't, I mean, it's only 15% off what Chloe won the electorate with. I just wondered, what did you find campaigning around Auckland Central to be like? Did you ever think that it could flip green in the end?
Yeah, I I thought that it could. I seriously considered running in Auckland Central to win the electorate, um, because the two highest polling areas were Wellington Central and Auckland Central. So clearly, there was already there was always going to be a solid base there, and I thought the electorate, you know, inner city, urban, um, was always going to be a good place to campaign for Greens, especially if you're doing creative stuff. Like in that first election in '99, you know, we didn't have any resources and there was no campaign committee, so we were just making it up and doing whatever we could. So, you know, I remember going into record shops and leaving leaflets in all the records because I figured a lot of our supporters are going to be like vinyl hunters and stuff, you know. So back in the day, people were more into vinyl back those days. You know, but just kind of, I don't know, just doing stuff that was different. It wasn't just like another political party. It was like we'd turn up and do stuff that you wouldn't expect from politicians, you know. Yeah, yeah. So I thought that Auckland Central had potential, and as I say, I considered standing there, but my own personal life was such that I was moving out of Auckland, and so um, the party was very reluctant to support electorate campaigns because the feeling was it sucked up a lot of resources, which it does, and what you ended up have is people kind of ticking green for the electorate vote and then ticking Labour for the party vote. And if you didn't win the seat, which was unlikely, then you lost a lot of potential. You know, those numbers didn't come your way. You know, so so the party was always reluctant to support electorate campaigns. They did support Sue Bradford running in Rodney, which I thought was a real mistake because I couldn't see how we were ever going to win an electorate like Rodney. And we would have been better to have done Auckland Central or Wellington. Yeah, but anyway, in the end, it just worked out that the timing was off for me, and I moved away. Yeah, but I thought, and you know, seeing Chloe take that was just fantastic. Auckland Central's always, again, it's always been a place that's a bit unpredictable anyway. You know, Richard Prebble held it, Sandra Lee held it. You know, so the electorate's always been shown itself willing to elect unexpected people. And it's never a predictable electorate, but yeah, but seeing Chloe win it was just fantastic. I mean, she's so great. She's such a star, really. You know, she's awesome, so courageous, and real, and super intelligent and super informed. Yeah, huge respect to her, Chloe. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. We get a lot of that going around door knocking as well.
I bet. Yeah, yeah. She's got a huge
Um,
following actually, and again, from people, all kinds of people who aren't typical Green supporters. They're like, oh yeah, but I like that Chloe, you know,
mm.
because she's really authentic, and I think people are really looking for that. They're looking for authenticity, you know, and you don't see it a lot in politicians.
Unfortunately, yeah. You were known by the media, primarily and perhaps a bit unfairly as the voice for cannabis reform, because you did do a lot of other work as well. But and you tried to push through some reforms there, in terms of the hemp amendment bill and that sort of thing. I imagine you got pretty fierce resistance trying to do that sort of work in the House.
Yeah, yeah. But to be honest, though, the most frustrating thing was the resistance within the party at that time. Um, and in fact, I mean, I was pretty much told not to campaign on cannabis because it was divisive in the party. And so I was kind of told, oh, you can respond if we're attacked on it, but you can't actually go out and proactively campaign. And that was a real error. And in fact, I had people who would advise that position later come and apologise to me because they recognised it was a mistake. Because actually, given the momentum that was behind cannabis law reform at the time, which was huge, the polls all showed that the majority of New Zealanders supported law reform of some kind, at least a kind of grow your own decriminalised model. A couple of years previously, I can't remember if it was the Health Committee, I think it might have been the Health Committee, had an inquiry into the mental health effects of cannabis and come out and said that the mental health effects had been grossly exaggerated, that most people used it responsibly, and that the government should look at changing the law. So given all of that, in 1999 when the Greens were elected, because of course we didn't get in on election night, we got in on the special votes a week or two later. And by that time, the government had kind of formed, the Alliance and Labour was doing their thing. And then they realised, oh, damn, we actually need the Greens for a majority. And at the time, we were also inexperienced. We didn't really understand the enormous leverage that we had. And the Greens have never been in a position as powerful as that since. That was the most powerful position we'd ever been in. And what we should have done, because Helen Clark said, we can't just push a law through, we'll have an inquiry. And we allowed ourselves to be seduced by that. And that was a real mistake. In fact, what we should have done is said, change the law this year, full stop, or you don't get our support. And we would have cannabis law reform if we'd done that. And that's one of my lessons as an activist, I think, as well, is that when you have leverage, you have to be uncompromising. You've got to be outrageous in your demands when you have leverage, because when you don't have leverage, no one gives you nothing. So you got to use the opportunity to the max when you've got it. We could have got cannabis law reform through in the year 2000 if we'd done that. But the problem was that the party was not united around it. Even though it was party policy, the party was not united around it, and that meant that that weakened the position.
Yeah, interesting. And then, obviously, I'm sure, like a lot of us, you were disappointed with the result of the 2020 referendum. What do you think of how the Yes campaign was handled there?
First of all, I actually wasn't disappointed with the result. I was amazed it was that close, because no one had ever campaigned really on a legalized market before that. All of the campaigning and the public education had been around decriminalisation. And if you'd had a referendum on decriminalisation, it would have won by a huge majority. And Andrew Little, to his credit, he looked at the evidence and he said, actually, no, decriminalisation won't solve all of the problems. It might go some way, but to really solve the problems of prohibition, you need a regulated market. And he's quite right, you do. And that's what he put up. And at the time, the movement, we had a big conference, and the cannabis law reform movement can be quite divided, and there's a lot of prickly, difficult characters in there too. And getting everyone to agree is quite a challenge. But we all agreed on some basic things for the referendum. And one of them was, we want a 2-part referendum. We want a question that says, do you think cannabis should be, do you think people over 18 should be made criminal for using cannabis? Yes or no? And do you think people over the age of 18 should be able to buy cannabis in shops? Essentially, those are the 2 questions. So it's decriminalisation and legalisation. And you can say yes to both, or you can say yes to one of them. And that's what we said, because we knew at the time that a referendum on a regulated market was most likely to fail. And, people like Ross Bell, who was with the Drug Foundation and he's gone now, was saying, no, we can win that for sure. We can win that. No sweat, And I think he and others had the ear of Andrew Little, and they convinced the minister that was a winnable proposition. And it was always going to be a real challenge to get that over the line. And then the other thing I'd say is that the government itself was kind of missing in action. So they put up a referendum They didn't allow the Greens, as far as I understand, to have really any input as to how that referendum was shaped or formed or worded. So it was a Labor. The whole thing was controlled by Labor, and then when it came to the campaign, they really did nothing. They did very, very little, and including the Prime Minister refusing to say how she was going to vote, which, I think was ridiculous. Um, so, and at the same time, the movement wasn't really in a good place to run it, because the movement hadn't been very strong for quite a while. It had peaked and was in a bit of a trough, was in a bit of a lull period. And the movement had never asked for a referendum. In fact, the movement has always said, we don't want a referendum. It shouldn't be a question of a referendum. We're talking about our human rights. That shouldn't go to referendum. We just want a law change. And so the movement, it's not something the movement had asked for. It was not something the movement was prepared for. It was a surprise to everyone. Suddenly, we're going to have to campaign for this thing. And as I say, was at a low ebb, really, and had no money. Not many people, not many activists. So kind of people did the best that they could. And I think produced some good stuff. I think there was some good parts of it. But the campaign certainly wasn't as good as it could have been or should have been. And the whole thing was a bit of a shambles, to be honest. Like, as I say, including the wording of the referendum and what people were being asked to vote on.
Do you think that result has set us back? Because I think it was when Andrew Little was still Minister for Health, he said there was now no mandate for change, even though the result was so close. So do you think that's set us back a little bit?
Well, that was my other disappointment, really, was that Andrew Little took that stance. I thought that was ridiculous, because actually, given that it was so close, you could say there was no mandate for a regulated market, but there absolutely was a mandate for at least decriminalising cannabis. And in fact, some of the people who campaigned against the referendum said they would support a decriminalisation model. So there was completely a mandate for some kind of change. And so for Andrew Little to say, basically, I think he just had enough, right? He's like, I just don't want to deal with that anymore. So no, it's off the table. But really, really unhelpful. And because that's how Andrew Little and I guess the government has chose to respond, it has put us back, because now it's much more difficult to campaign, because everyone goes, oh, well, you had your referendum and you lost it.
Yeah.
Yeah. But the other thing I'd say that's come out of that, though, is I think there's a lot of campaigners who, not necessarily normal campaigners, but wider drug policy people and harm reduction people who supported that campaign, who are actually going, it's not really about cannabis. It's about the Misuse of Drugs Act. We need to repeal the Misuse of Drugs Act. And that's quite an exciting thing, because that's right. It's not about cannabis. It's about how we regulate recreational drugs in their entirety, whether that's tobacco or alcohol or methamphetamine or LSD or MDMA or cannabis or caffeine. We are a drug-using society, and we need to kind of get to grips with that. And the amount of self-righteous hypocrisy that still abounds when you talk about anything other than alcohol is just astounding. Given that alcohol is one of the most dangerous drugs available in our society. But I think this idea that you've got to look at the Misuse of Drugs Act as a whole. I think that's the right approach, because also you're getting this amazing stuff now coming out from the international research and that people have been working on for decades as well, around the therapeutic use of like MDMA or mescaline, or LSD, and there's a whole lot of stuff coming out now. All that stuff around Silicon Valley executives microdosing on mushrooms, it's just so much more. There's so much more awareness of this stuff, and people, I think, are starting to become more realistic and just go, well, why shouldn't people be able to do that stuff? Like retirement homes, why shouldn't old people, in the twilight of their life, why shouldn't they be able to take LSD? if they want to,
Yeah.
you know, and help get them ready for the fact that they're in their last years, you know.
Yeah.
Certainly that's what I want when I'm getting there, you know.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Um, one of your other
Actually,
big
probably cactus rather than LSD. But
yeah.
keep it natural. Keep it natural.
One of your other big achievements that you had in Parliament was the waste minimization bill, and that raises something that gets said a lot about you in your time in Parliament, which was that you were really good at building cross party relationships.
That's
Um,
nice.
how did you find that process going about building those relationships? Was it difficult sometimes?
Um, I find if you speak to people's values, and often we share values across the political divide, and you treat people as kind of intelligent people who are not idiots or immoral, but just people with a different view, you can actually come to points of agreement about all kinds of things. My first go really trying to build bridges was we set up a cross-party accord on justice, because I got really concerned about the way justice is used as a law and order and crime stuff. It's used as a political football. And so we started a group across different parties to say, well, okay, there's some things we'll never agree on, but let's find out where we can agree, you know, and let's get some stuff on the table and sign up to the thing that we're not going to make this football. We're going to all sign up to some principles that we all agree with. And what I found is working with small parties was generally really easy. ACT wouldn't be involved, but Māori Party was, you know, actually I can't remember if the Māori Party was there at the time, but we had, you know, like Labour was not really active, but they were interested and they kept to watching brief. New Zealand First was there, United Future was there, people who, you know, didn't get on with the Greens at all on most things. National would have nothing to do with it, and ACT wouldn't have anything to do with it either. But everyone else, actually, there was the bulk of kind of who was represented in Parliament actually did some really good work and
Mhm.
and kind of came up with an accord. With the waste minimisation, that was really interesting because that was working in the select committee, and my stance was I don't have all the answers. We may not have written it wrong. So there may be lots of things wrong with the bill, but the intention is right. So can we work from that basis that we have an intention? We can sort out the details. And we actually had a really lengthy select committee process. It went for over a year, I think. And um, and as we worked through the issues, and we did a lot of site visits to different places, and we travelled around. We talked to a lot of people, and by having a really open, honest dialogue and not pretending like I knew everything, I think we were able to build a lot of agreement. And you know, so that bill went into the select committee with Labour and Green votes only, I think, or maybe United Future went in supported as well. I can't remember. But it went in with a bare majority, and when it came out, it was almost unanimous. It was only ACT who didn't support it coming out of select committee, and you know that's that's a credit to everyone's willingness to work together to try and resolve an issue that, as we went through, everyone increasingly understood what a serious issue it was as well. You know, so I believe that you know we can build agreement about all kinds of issues, and we may disagree on that thing, but we can agree on that thing. And I'm really into a way of operating politically, which doesn't just factionalize and go, we don't agree with that because you said it, but we're going to deal with each issue on the facts as we know them and try and
Mm.
build bridges across them as much as we can. I find it a much more effective way of doing things and much more enduring, because you can force things through with the numbers, but then there's a change of government and they just change it all. You know, you've got to build some shared understanding and commitment to the thing.
Absolutely. Do you think maybe with politics and the world getting a bit more divided, do you think we're moving towards a place where those sort of relationships aren't going to be possible anymore?
I wouldn't say wouldn't be possible, but becoming increasingly difficult. One of the things that disturbs me, and it's driven a lot by the way that the way we act on social media, which becomes very anonymous, and people say things that they wouldn't say to your face. And what I'm seeing is we're becoming more polarized. And the thing that particularly worries me is not that we have different opinions. Different opinions are great. I mean, I don't want a world where we all have the same opinion. We want to. It's good that we think differently, but that difference of opinion has to be grounded in a fundamental respect for each other. As I said before, we've got to come from the view that you're not an idiot and you're not evil just because you think something different from me. You have good reasons for thinking what you do, and I have good reasons for thinking what I do. And when we have a discussion, actually, here's an opportunity for us both to go away better informed, because you've got no doubt have got something you can teach me, and I've no doubt got something I can teach you. And if we start from that point of view, I think we can build bridges. But people seem to be less and less willing to do that, and more quick to jump to kind of labeling and objectifying people, right? And just kind of stereotyping people. That's really unhelpful. I think we've got to make real efforts to speak with each other respectfully, and to listen, and to engage in a really responsive way, and to build a political culture of respect for difference of opinion.
Yeah, absolutely. So then, after about, I think it was a decade, nearly in Parliament, you gave a very beautiful and poignant valedictory, and then you left Parliament. What did you find that process like? I mean, after such a long time, it must have been strange not being there.
It was very difficult. I got really depressed for a long time. It took me a long time to recover. It's such a all-encompassing thing. It's 24/7, and it takes over your life, and I became institutionalized by it. One of the reasons I left was because I realized the things I was doing when I first went in, I wouldn't even think of doing after almost 9 years. I became, just kind of. I like to think I changed the system, but it changed me just as much. So I'd become institutionalized, and coming out suddenly, I kind of didn't really know my place in things. What was my role now? What did I do, and how did I relate to the world? And what do I do with myself? And I made a mistake. I tried to do stuff. I should have just gone, actually, I'm going to take 6 months or a year off and just go do whatever, and not feel any obligation to do anything very much. But I didn't. I tried to do things, and I ended up just wasting probably a year anyway, but not really in a very healing kind of way. So I think coming out of those kinds of things, my wife, when she did her PhD, it was a very similar thing. Finishing that, it's almost like a grieving process of what do I do now, and who am I, and a kind of loss of confidence. You've just done this amazing stuff, but you kind of lose confidence. So it's very difficult. And I also got very depressed because even though I went into Parliament not thinking much of Parliament, not believing that Parliament was going to solve any of our problems really, that the solutions come from the grassroots, but nevertheless, just being so clear coming out that Parliament's just incapable of grappling with the big issues because of this. There are systemic things about it, including a really short parliamentary term, but there's a whole lot of systemic things about it that make the Parliament incapable of grappling, or very challenging to grapple with, the real fundamental issues that require long-term thinking. And that realization really depressed me as well. So it was really hard. I really struggled, and it was probably a good couple of years before I kind of felt I'd come back to myself. I kind of recognized myself again, because I'd become a bit of a stranger. Because the other thing is you're playing this public role, and everyone thinks they know who you are, and the media's saying stuff about you, and none of it's really who you are. It's like a persona that lives outside of you almost in public, and you're trying to make it authentic because it needs to reflect who you are, but at the same time, it's not you. It's this public image, right? And so that kind of got further and further away from who I essentially am. And so the process of trying to incorporate or integrate myself again, it was difficult. It was hard. It was hard.
Yeah, absolutely. I can imagine. And then some years later, you got elected to your current job, which is a councillor at Whakatāne District Council. Have you found the space being in council much different than it was to be in Parliament? Is it a very different experience?
Really different, yeah. One thing, and this is not true in all councils, but in Whakatāne, we're not factionalised. So we don't, people have very different political views and perspectives, but we don't vote in blocks. We vote on each issue. And that's so refreshing, because I can talk to someone who I totally disagree with on some things, but we can ally on something else, you know. And when you have a debate, the debate's meaningful because people might actually change their vote in Parliament, except on a conscience vote. All the rest of the time, it doesn't matter what you say. It's not going to make any difference to the outcome. You're just putting it on record. In council, what you say might actually change the outcome. It's also a very different process. You're really constrained. Councils are so constrained by legislation, and central government's constantly putting new jobs on councils, on local councils, without resourcing councils, and kind of government or Parliament, central government treats local councils like idiots. And I probably was subject to a bit of that myself when I did the waste minimisation. I probably wasn't really fully conscious of what councils actually do or what this was going to mean for council. I was just like, oh, you can just deal with it, you know. And now being in council gives me quite a different perspective. And I really think we need constitutional change on a number of things, including a constitution that reflects Te Tiriti o Waitangi. But also, I think we need a constitution that recognises the inherent right of local decision making. Because currently councils are a creature of statute, and the government could just get rid of them overnight if it wanted to, just pass a law. I think we need a constitution that says actually local people have a right to make decisions locally, certain kinds of decisions locally, and that can't be taken away by the Parliament. And then along with that, there's a whole lot of things that would come along with that as well, you know. But I enjoy council because it's really direct too. It's like in Parliament, sometimes it felt like chucking bricks over a wall, and you're never quite sure if someone's using them to build a house or whether they're knocking people out, you know. Whereas in council, you know, you go to the supermarket and you pretty soon find out what people think.
Yeah, absolutely. Much more engaged.
Yeah, it's really direct. It's you're connected with the local community, with your communities. Yeah.
Would you say you have a career high from your time in all of this?
I don't know about a particular moment. I mean, I think probably the biggest moment actually is I remember when we were first elected in our first caucus meeting as Greens and sitting in around that table, newly elected, and the feeling of just infinite possibility, you know, and the realization we just crashed their ship. Have you seen that? There's that Monty Python movie where those pirates take over that corporate building, and it kind of reminded me of that. It's like we'd crashed the club, and we were taken over, you know, and anything was possible. And it was just this amazing feeling. And of course, come along with that is this huge responsibility because all these people work their asses off to put you there, and you're carrying their hopes. You know, they're there. You're there to do a job on their behalf, not for yourself. So it's a huge responsibility. But what an amazing thing! And when I left Parliament, I cut my hair, my dreads, as a cleansing, and I burnt them as a cleansing ritual. And as I did that, you know, I gave thanks because regardless of anything else, it was such an honour. It was such an honour to be in the New Zealand Parliament, to be a member of the legislature, to be there on behalf of the Green Party and all the green thinking people who worked and who voted for us, you know. An enormous privilege. Yeah, is
Yeah,
yeah, what an amazing thing.
absolutely. How about any, not necessarily regrets, but are there things you wish that you maybe pushed a bit harder on?
The big thing is the cannabis law reform in the first term. Like I said, I think apart from that, uh, I don't think there's anything else I particularly regret. But I really regret that we didn't force a law change in that first term when we had so much leverage and we just didn't understand what we had. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Um, I can imagine in all aspects of your life, really, there would have been times when the forces you were coming up against would have seemed insurmountable, nearly. I mean, did you ever suffer from like burnout or struggling to keep on going there?
Um, I've always taken the view that it's one step at a time, you know. And so, like, sometimes if I felt overwhelmed by the responsibility of what I was doing, I was just like, "Don't worry about that. You just got to focus on what do you have to do next, you know." And it's the same with that. Try to confront big issues. You've just got to focus on what can I do now to
Mm.
move us towards the goal. And so, like, never compromising the goal, but recognizing that you can't do everything at once, you know. Um, so I don't know that I ever kind of got burnout or got overwhelmed by the enormity of things. But um, I think what I found was towards the end.